Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into something absolutely fascinating. We are neutrally investigating a provocative and, frankly, hotly debated thesis brought forward by investigative journalist Graham Hancock. It's a theory that completely challenges the very foundations of how we understand our own past, suggesting that humanity has, for all intents and purposes, forgotten its own highly advanced history. We're going to break down his claims, look closely at the evidence he presents, and explore exactly how mainstream science pushes back. Let's get right into it.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with a species with amnesia, then investigate the Great Cataclysm, look at monuments out of time, explore science and shamanism, and finally ask the big question, are we next?
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, a species with amnesia.
So Hancock proposes this wild idea. You know that standard linear progression of history we all learned in school? The one where we slowly evolved from hunter-gatherers, eventually figured out agriculture, and then slowly built up to modern technology? Well, he argues that everything we know is actually built right on top of the ruins of a forgotten, pre-existing civilization. He literally calls us a species with amnesia. As you can see in the definition here, the core idea is that deep in the past, humanity reached a level of sophistication far beyond what mainstream archaeology currently acknowledges. But a catastrophic event just reset the clock, erasing almost all of it and leaving only fragmented memories encoded in myth and stone.
That brings us to Section 2, the Great Cataclysm.
Now, if you're going to erase an entire advanced civilization, you would need a truly apocalyptic, world-ending event. And that points us to a highly controversial period in our planet's geological record. The focal point of this destruction, according to Hancock, occurred approximately 12,800 years ago. Right at this exact time, the Earth experienced a sudden, dramatic, and violent cold snap that lasted for about 1,200 years. Hancock points out that if an advanced civilization existed back then, they would have lived exactly where humans always live, on coastlines and river deltas. So when this event hit, it would have totally decimated those low-lying settlements.
Scientists actually call this cold snap the Younger Dryas period. And Hancock leans heavily on this concept you see here, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. Proponents of this theory point to geological deposits found all over the world containing nanodiamonds, microspherules, and iridium. Now, why does that matter? Because those are the telltale signatures of a massive cosmic impact. Just imagine a fragmented comet hitting the Earth, triggering catastrophic continental wildfires, rapid melting of glaciers, and sea levels rising by literally hundreds of feet in a terrifyingly short amount of time. It's a cascade of destruction that would easily swallow any coastal civilization whole.
Take a look at this comparison on the screen because it's super interesting how two different camps interpret the exact same human artifacts, in this case, our ancient stories. From the Mesopotamian Epic of Gilgamesh to the biblical Noah to Hindu texts and indigenous stories all across the Americas, flood myths are practically universal, right? Well, Hancock argues the sheer consistency of these stories points to a shared, literal memory of this 12,800-year cataclysm. But on the other hand, mainstream scholars interpret these narratives as either exaggerated memories of localized river floods or just universal psychological archetypes arising from our human relationship with water and chaos.
Moving right along to Section 3, monuments out of time.
So, if an advanced civilization did exist before the ice melted, they surely would have left something behind in stone, right? And that brings us to the physical anomalies that deeply puzzle scientists today. Let's look at Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey. Discovered in the 1990s, this site is absolutely staggering. We're talking about massive T-shaped stone pillars, some of them weighing up to 20 tons, and they are perfectly arranged in these circular enclosures, intricately carved with abstract figures and animals.
Check out this timeline, because it brilliantly illustrates the massive chronological problem mainstream archaeology faces right now. Göbekli Tepe dates back to 11,600 years ago, placing it right at the tail end of the Younger Dryas. To put that into perspective, that predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years and the Great Pyramid by 7,000 years. But here's the real kicker. It was built thousands of years before the accepted invention of agriculture. And until this discovery, agriculture was thought to be the absolute prerequisite for organizing the kind of labor required to build monumental architecture like this.
So how in the world did a bunch of hunter-gatherers build this? Look at how the views split here. Mainstream archaeology views Göbekli Tepe as this paradigm-shifting proof that complex social organizations simply preceded agriculture. Basically, they just organized earlier than we thought. But Hancock, he sees it completely differently. He argues that hunter-gatherers couldn't just invent this level of masonry out of thin air. Instead, he thinks the builders of Göbekli Tepe inherited this highly sophisticated knowledge from the survivors of that great cataclysm. Adding even more mystery to the whole shebang, the site appears to have been deliberately buried under massive amounts of dirt around 10,000 years ago. Hancock suggests this might have been a deliberate effort to preserve it. Let's shift over to Egypt and see how this argument builds. Hancock argues the Great Pyramid of Giza isn't just a tomb, but a literal repository of advanced scientific knowledge. Notice the geometric encodings highlighted in these bullet points. When you multiply the pyramid's base perimeter by a specific factor, you actually get a highly accurate approximation of the Earth's polar circumference. Its perimeter-to-height ratio is extremely close to 2 pi. So Hancock poses the question, how could the Egyptians 4,500 years ago have known the exact circumference of the Earth when European science didn't definitively establish it until the modern era? He believes this advanced math was a legacy, perfectly preserved in stone by a custodian culture.
And as you can see mapped out here, the dating of the Great Sphinx is contested in a very similar way. Geologist Robert Schoch argues that the deep, undulating fissures on the Sphinx enclosure are the undeniable result of heavy rainfall, not just wind and sand. The catch? The Giza Plateau hasn't seen that kind of heavy, sustained rain for at least 7,000 to 10,000 years. This effectively pushes the creation of the Sphinx way back to the era of the Younger Dryas. Mainstream Egyptologists, however, vehemently reject this. They argue that the erosion patterns are perfectly explained by centuries of wind and sand over the last 5,000 years.
All right, shifting gears for Section 4, Science and Shamanism.
Moving beyond physical stone and geology, Hancock's thesis takes a deeply philosophical turn here, relying heavily on the exploration of human consciousness itself. Notice this comparison we've laid out, where Western materialist science brilliantly maps the external physical world using objective measurement. Shamanic traditions have spent millennia mapping the internal landscape. Hancock points out that ancient indigenous practices, specifically the deliberate use of psychedelics like ayahuasca, which contains DMT, aren't primitive superstition. Instead, he views them as a parallel system of scientific inquiry, using altered states as tools to access dimensions of reality that modern science just refuses to take seriously.
This quote on the screen really captures his frustration. To Hancock, confidently dismissing shamanic wisdom is just a form of cultural arrogance. He proposes that these altered states of consciousness might actually be ancient transmission methods, basically ways of accessing and preserving profound knowledge about the true nature of reality, handed down directly from that same sophisticated civilization that was lost to the ice and floods.
Which brings us to our final section, Part 5. Are we next? What begins as an investigation into deep history ultimately turns into a pretty stark warning for the present day. Take a look at this list of modern threats. Hancock notes that our own civilization shares an eerie vulnerability to catastrophic disruption. I mean, despite our extraordinary technological achievements, just consider what we're facing. Climate change, environmental degradation, massive nuclear arsenals, and incredibly fragile interconnected global supply chains. If a highly advanced civilization could be completely erased from the map 12,800 years ago, what makes us so sure our glass and steel towers are permanent? Look at this table breaking down ancient views of time. It brings a deeply mythological framing to our modern era. Notice how many ancient cultures viewed history not as a straight line progressing upward, but as a cycle of rising and falling ages. You've got the Hindu Yugas, the Mesoamerican World Ages, the Greek Ages of Metal. They all speak of great civilizations that rise, reach a pinnacle, and then are destroyed, leaving a few survivors to start all over again. Hancock believes these aren't just fun metaphors, they are literal, urgent warnings passed down from the people who actually survived the last great collapse.
So where does that leave us? You can see the dividing line right here on how this entire debate is structured today. Hancock positions himself as an outsider championing critical thinking, urging all of us to question institutional authority and demanding intellectual humility when we face massive historical mysteries like Göbekli Tepe. On the flip side, mainstream academics emphasize the extreme danger of motivated reasoning. Critics argue that Hancock lacks the technical expertise to properly evaluate the highly specialized evidence he cites. They say his grand narrative relies far too much on negative evidence, essentially asking us to believe in a lost civilization precisely because all the proof of it was washed away.
Ultimately, whether you view Graham Hancock's thesis as a compelling case of hidden history or simply a brilliantly engaging modern myth, this debate absolutely forces us to confront the unknown, glaring gaps in our own human story. And it leaves us with a pretty haunting realization about the undeniable fragility of our modern world. So here's a final thought to leave you with. If an advanced